And these come from Luke chapter 1 and verse 1 to 4. So many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So this week in Holiday Club, we've been exploring, as I said, the life of Jesus using this resource called The Diary of a Disciple, Luke's story. It's basically a retelling of Luke's story in the style of a Tom Gates novel, for those of you who have any idea who Tom Gates might be. And the New Testament, it starts with 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. There's one written by a guy called Matthew, one written by somebody called Mark, one written by somebody called Luke, and that's the one we've been looking at this week, and one written by somebody called John. And each of these accounts of Jesus' life are slightly different to each other. They're written from a different perspective. They're written for a different audience. And so some things one writer will include, but someone else will leave out because it's not particularly relevant to the particular angle that they're taking with the story. And we don't need to be worried about the differences between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As any policeman or policewoman will tell you, that if you've got a series of eyewitnesses who've all seen the same thing and you ask them to write down an eyewitness statement, if they are all identical, then you're fairly confident that some kind of collusion and corruption is going on. It's the slight differences between those eyewitness accounts that means that they're almost certainly genuine and authentic. Luke was a doctor. He's the nearest thing that the New Testament has to what we might refer to as a scientist. He was also a Gentile, so he wasn't Jewish. He wasn't from a Jewish background. He was from a Greek background. And although he wasn't a detective, he was interested in evidence. He wanted to collect the evidence. And at some point in his life, Luke had heard the story about Jesus. It might have been on one of Paul's missionary journeys when Paul was going around telling people about Jesus. But at some point, Luke heard this story for the first time. And we don't know very much about Luke's personal story, but something about this story must have intrigued him. Luke was a man of science. He was a doctor. And so he was probably a little bit skeptical when he heard these stories about people getting healed of all kinds of diseases. Luke's job was making people get better. And he knew from experience that that didn't just happen. And then there were accounts of people coming back to life. They were dead and they'd come back to life. And then there was this story about the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. But something must have convinced Luke that these stories were true. Maybe it was when he got to witness a miracle firsthand. Maybe it was when he got to speak to somebody like Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, those that had been with him for the whole of his life, seen all the things he'd done, heard all the things he'd said. And maybe it was as he listened to those eyewitness accounts that he realized, yes, these stories are true. Maybe it was that he watched people risk their lives by saying Jesus is Lord as opposed to Caesar is Lord. And maybe it was that made him think there must be something in these stories if these people are prepared to die for them. But at some point, Luke decided that these stories were true and that he wanted to follow Jesus and he wanted to pledge his allegiance to Jesus. Luke wrote 2 books in the New Testament. He wrote the one that we know as Luke's Gospel, and then he also wrote the book of Acts. So the story of the early church, the kind of the what happened next, what happened after Jesus came back to life and went into heaven. It's the sequel. So you've got the story of the Gospel of Luke, where you've got the things that Jesus did in person, and then you've got the story of Acts, the things that Jesus did through the Holy Spirit. And the book of Acts basically follows two individuals. It follows, first of all, the first part follows the story of Peter, and then the second part picks up on the story of Paul, as they take the story of Jesus from Jerusalem and they spread out all over the known world. And as they go, that story transforms life after life after life. And part way through the book of Acts, the story or the account goes from they did this and they said that and they went there to we did this and we said that. So at some point in that story, obviously Luke teamed up with Paul, and Luke was a part of that team that was going around telling people about Jesus. And it was probably as he was doing that he discovered that there were all kinds of stories about Jesus. There were all kinds of things being said about Jesus. There was all sorts of speculation swirling around about who Jesus really was and what all this meant. And that there was this Jewish story that was impacting on the Greek and the Roman world. And at some point, Luke, as a scientific Greek, as an intelligent person, as a doctor, he decided that what was needed was a written down, verified eyewitness account of what actually happened, so that people didn't have to rely on kind of the rumours that were going around and the stories that were going around, but that there would be a documented, written, checked out account, so that people could be confident, people could be certain as to what it was that Jesus did and what it was that Jesus had said. Anastasia, there's a little video to go in here, please. You might need to go back. I think it might be before this one.
Good evening, and a very warm welcome to my marvellous story. My name is Luke, Dr. Luke, actually, and I've been carefully investigating a series of mysterious events. And because I'm a bit of a nerd, I've decided to write all of my investigations down, just for you. Lots of other people have tried to write it all down before, but I want you to hear my side of the story.
So that's what he did. He wrote it all down, and we're going to think a little bit more about the next bit in just a minute. But before we do that, we are going to pray. We're going to read another bit from Luke. So this is from Luke chapter 9 and verses 18 to 20. And it says, once, when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, "Who do the crowds say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "God's Messiah." And so Jesus asks Peter this question: "Who do you say I am?" And for Luke, this is one of the most important questions that we could ever face, because the answer to this question has the power to transform lives. And so Luke gives us the evidence that we need in order to answer this question. Luke wants us to be able to read and have confidence in the things that Jesus said and the things that Jesus did. He wants us to be able to put all that together, put all those clues together, put all the evidence together, And he wants us to come to the same conclusion that Peter came to: you are the Messiah. On Monday, if you were here at Holiday Club, you would have seen we had the Christmas trees up, we had Christmas jumpers, we had Christmas decorations. On Monday, we were looking at the Christmas story. On Friday, we got as far as the Easter story. But those two stories in and of themselves don't make a lot of sense. And Luke deliberately fits his story into a much bigger story. The way that Luke starts his story, the things that Luke puts in there, he's deliberately fitting it into a much bigger story. And it's a story that starts with an unbroken relationship. God, the creator of the universe, and people are able to occupy the same space safely. They're able to enjoy each other's company. And there is this picture painted of walking in a garden, God and people walking in a garden, talking together. But then those people decide that they want to do things rather than trust God. They want to do things their way. And I'm sure that we can all identify with that I know best kind of feeling. And I'm sure we've all felt that at some point. And so this relationship is broken and the people are sent out from God's presence because that space is no longer a safe space for them to be in. Rebellious people in the presence of a holy God would be killed just as I would burn up if I was to get too close to the sun. But God wants to be with his people. And so he provides ways in which it is safe for people to come closer to him. But people continue, as we read through the Bible story, they continue to want to do it their way. They want it on their own terms, and this story kind of spirals from bad to worse. And it keeps on getting worse until we get to Jesus, the story of his birth, the story of his life, the story of his death, the story of his resurrection. And at the point that Jesus dies in Luke's story, it records what might seem to be an irrelevant or insignificant detail. Luke tells us that the curtain of the temple was torn in two at the point at which Jesus died on the cross. It might seem like a strange detail for Luke to include at that point. But this curtain was symbolic of that broken relationship. It symbolized the barrier between God's space and people's space. In the temple, God's space was represented by the Holy of Holies, and there was this curtain that no one could go beyond. And then you had other areas where people could come. Depending on who you were, you could come closer or further, but you couldn't get beyond the curtain, which was symbolized this broken relationship, this barrier between God and people. And so you've got God inhabiting this side of the curtain and people inhabiting the other side. But when Jesus died, Luke tells us that that curtain was torn in two. That barrier was gone. There was no longer any barrier between God's space and people space. Jesus' death meant that that broken relationship can be restored. It's like, because of Jesus' death, we can walk in the garden, we can talk in the garden with God again. And that truth, that this relationship can be restored, transformed Peter's life. It transformed Paul's life. It transformed Luke's life. And it can transform our lives as well. Because of Jesus' death, we can know that broken relationship with God restored. I can know peace with God. I can know forgiveness for the past. I can know hope for the future. And so if Jesus was to ask us, who do you say I am? How would you answer that question? And if you don't know how to answer that question. I would encourage you maybe to talk to somebody who you know who is a follower of Jesus, or maybe even get hold of a copy of Luke's Gospel. Maybe find it online, or you can ask me afterwards, and I've got some to give away. And actually read it for yourself. Look at the evidence. What does Luke say? What did Jesus say? What did Jesus do? How did these people come to this conclusion that Jesus was the Messiah? Have a look at the evidence and see what it says and come to your own conclusions. We're going to pray.